Greetings. In this video I'm going to be referring to the PowerPoint set that I put up on geography. I think it's called Geography as Destiny or something like that. And I'm not going to be going through this exactly slide by slide, but it might be useful as you listen to me talk to have the PowerPoint slides up so that you can kind of flip through them and look and see what I'm referring to. I mean, first off, I don't think it's true of you guys, but when I first started teaching this class, I almost always had to put up slides of a world map and ask students to identify the location of Vietnam. So and in this set, I just start with a map of Southeast Asia. It gives you a little bit of orientation. So in this set of slides and in what I want to talk about today, I'm basically moving from geography to a kind of chronology, not exactly history, because I'm mostly just laying out a few markers in time at this point, and then trying to move on to issues having to do with culture and that sort of thing. It's funny, I'm just noticing looking at the monitor now as I'm doing this that the slides are reflecting in my glasses, and I don't know if it's distracting you, but it's distracting me. That's my dog coming into the room. So I'm not quite sure what to do about this. Maybe it'll get better with the new system that I'm going to start to use over the weekend. But for now, I'm sort of moving things around and trying to make them a little more aesthetically pleasing, but it's not really working all that well. Well, I'm going to just keep going with this because it's the easier thing to do. So Vietnamese civilization, as I've said right from the beginning, goes way back. There are Neolithic and Bronze Age civilizations, and the Bronze Age civilization in Vietnam was actually quite advanced, creating large bronze vessels with extensive decoration. Most famously, large bronze drums that were used in religious ceremonies. So as far back as the Bronze Age, the Vietnamese nation, though that's not maybe the right word, the Vietnamese location hosted a civilization that modern Vietnamese people refer back to as being their progenitors. Whether that's strictly true or not is a little bit more problematic. But in any case, as we find Stone Age tools going back 600,000 years, Neolithic, that is New Stone Age, 8,000, and then about 3,000 years ago, we get Bronze Age and the first intimation of actual historical characters in the so-called Hung Kings. And I think that Woods talks about the Hung Kings a little bit. And the fact is that there's a sense in which, for most Vietnamese people, Vietnamese history starts with the Hung Kings. They may think about a legendary time that precedes that, but there are shrines, and I've been to them in North Vietnam, that continue to honor this semi-legendary dynasty, though based probably on some actual historical figures. So that kind of takes care of time. I mentioned in a comment on the forum this morning that the Vietnamese people often use a sort of almost shorthand phrase to refer to their nation and its geography, mountains and rivers. This is actually adapted from the Chinese, who do the same thing, but in Vietnam it's perhaps even more true than it is in China. So I put a couple of Landsat photos here of the Red River Delta in the north, and this is the area of the oldest identifiably Vietnamese civilization. As the map a little later in the set shows, historically until about the 18th century, Vietnam was effectively what we would now think of as northern Vietnam, and that specifically that region surrounding the Red River Delta. And if you're interested in this, you can pop up Google Maps and really zoom in and look at the geography and get a good look. In fact, I kind of recommend that. I think it's a really nice way to kind of take a virtual tour of the country. But river systems are important for communication because one can go up and down a river more easily than cutting through forest and jungle or climbing over mountains. And they're important because the way that they flooded was responsible initially for the development of wet rice agriculture, which I'll be talking about in a little bit of time. And we'll have occasion as the semester goes on to make some distinctions between northern and southern Vietnam. But in the early period, remember that there's only northern Vietnam. And what I guess you would call social ecology is defined by several kind of things that we can summarize: enclosed villages, small fields, small land holdings, unpredictable floods, a conservative political order, and a Confucian worldview. We'll talk a bit more about Confucianism over the next couple of days. And a frankly authoritarian view of the way that power should be wielded. That is, Confucianism essentially puts an emperor at the top of the system, and everybody else owes allegiance up the chain to the emperor. Though, interestingly, in Confucianism, as we'll see a little bit later, the king or the emperor also has responsibilities that reach downward, and if he neglects those responsibilities, there are, at least in theory, consequences. He can lose what's called the mandate of heaven. So in the north, that's the kind of way that the society is set up along very traditional lines. And as we go a little further in both time and geography, in time toward the future and in geography toward the south, we'll see that in southern Vietnam that social ecology is a little bit different. So basically, to reiterate and to go back to chronology, about the 2nd century BCE, that's before current era, which is the standard usage these days, Vietnamese society has its first political and cultural context with its giant neighbor to the north, China. That relationship will, over the millennia, be a very interesting, vexed, and paradoxical relationship. In 208 BCE, Chiao Da establishes Nam Viet, and he is essentially a Chinese warlord of ethnic Vietnamese extraction, and he creates a little mini-state which becomes a vassal state to the great Chinese Empire. And then in 111 BCE, the Chinese Han Dynasty simply incorporates Vietnam as part of China itself. This initiates a 1,000-year period of Chinese rule, a very interesting period in that the Chinese were famous in their early history for simply taking over other cultures and incorporating them, much the way an amoeba might incorporate a piece of food and simply turn it into its own protoplasm. Vietnam never became part of the protoplasm of China, even though it adopted many Chinese cultural practices, beliefs, aspects of Chinese language, but not the Chinese language itself except for official court documents. And Chinese cultural forms remained distinct and independent, and even throughout that 1,000-year period of Chinese hegemony, the Vietnamese people periodically rose up in rebellion and usually led by some charismatic leader or leaders. For that 1,000-year period, those revolts were, for the most part, fairly easily put down by the Chinese, but the spirit of revolt remained alive. As the Chinese period of dominance came to an end, the Vietnamese nation began slowly to expand southward under population pressure of the need for food, and the fact that even with the intensive wet rice agriculture in the Red River Delta, famine was often just a threat that hovered right around the Vietnamese consciousness all the time. Whereas in the South, agricultural production is much greater and the land is much more fertile, and so the Vietnamese began looking southward and sending colonists slowly down the coast to essentially displace native peoples who already lived there, and then those colonists would initially go kind of under military guise, and then they would become farmers. And so that was the general tendency moving south. And the full independence from China really comes in 939 CE, that's the current era, and Vietnam still has to fight off numerous Chinese invasions trying to take back what they considered their southern territory. But the fact is that even Genghis Khan could not conquer Vietnam, and there are numerous historical legends and stories, quasi-historical stories that have been elaborated, and just as in American history, there are culture heroes. We have, George Washington and the Continental Army and that sort of thing. Whereas in Vietnam, there are a number of generals and statesmen who are responsible for having fought off Chinese invasion, and they are revered to this day. People still think of them. There are streets named after them, so on and so forth. And going back momentarily to that move southward, about the middle of the 18th century, that is the 1700s, Vietnam finally drives the final Khmer tribespeople out of the Mekong River Delta in the south, and assumes its current borders more or less. And the Mekong Delta really led to much greater prosperity throughout Vietnam because, as I said a minute ago, the land is much more fertile and the weather is more cooperative. And it's important also to note that though there is considerable flooding in the south, the floods are a good deal more predictable, and they come at regular intervals, and it's possible for farmers to more or less plan their crops, and particularly rice agriculture, around the seasons of flood. So the social ecology in the South is that instead of small enclosed villages, literally with walls around them, as you find in the North, in the South you have open villages that tend to be strung along rivers. The general religious ideology is more Buddhist than Confucian. That is, it's much more egalitarian, much less authoritarian. And as the 18th century moves into the 19th century and then the 20th, much greater Western influence, that is European and ultimately American influence, in the southern part of the country. So I want to move on and conclude this video, which is already going quite a long time, by talking a little bit about wet rice agriculture. And the main thing to know about wet rice agriculture is that when it's developed, in really the Bronze Age period, the prehistoric period, it leads from small tribal groups living more or less independently and doing slash and burn agriculture to much larger social groups. And that's because wet rice agriculture demands the building and the maintaining of an extensive dike system so that the rice paddies can be flooded, so that the rice can be planted, harvested, transplanted. It's a very complicated set of procedures that we don't really need to go into here, but it requires much greater levels of social organization than would be found in typical small tribal societies, and it really leads to the development of the nation of Vietnam. That is, as the need for organization and bureaucracy increases, the Vietnamese develop social institutions and governmental institutions that function to make these things happen. And again, in the slide set, I put in some 19th century drawings of wet rice agriculture, some 20th century photographs of rice harvests, and that sort of thing. Rice is very important, both as a foodstuff, but as a cultural symbol. When you say in Vietnamese to a friend, let's eat, you say ăn cơm, which means eat rice. And rice is absolutely central. On one of the slides I put up a proverb, heaven reprimands whom it will, but never punishes a man when he is eating. And that basically means when he's eating rice. So that the development of wet rice agriculture and the centrality of rice really can't be overestimated. I think with that, I'm going to bring this video to a close. There are a few things in the slide set that I've been talking about that I haven't yet covered, and I'll start with them in the next video and then move on, I think, to another slide set. But I hope you'll find this helpful. Thanks. And by the way, you can start items on the forum yourselves. You don't have to wait for me to put up a topic. And for instance, an ideal situation would be if you had a question or an insight deriving from one of these little videos, you could post that in the forum, and I would be able to respond to it. That would, in a way, take the place of class discussion. So if you're motivated to do that, please feel free. Talk to you soon.